Welcome to the first podcast series here at The Coping Mechanism. In this series, we look at our survey findings, which looked at how people are coping in the COVID-19 pandemic. In each episode, we are joined by experts who give us a deeper understanding of these findings and an evaluation of what we can expect in the near future. I'm Malika Speaks, a poet and spoken word artist. I've been hosting these discussions, and I'll give you my thoughts and conclusions at the end of the video. This episode is called Trauma, Resilience and Meaning Making, where we look at what trauma means, resilience, which is how stronger we're becoming, and how we are making meaning through the pandemic. The reason why we're looking at this is because it's important to see how people are adapting and reacting to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as how relationships might be affected and how communities are coping. In this episode, we are joined by Micah, a mindfulness practitioner and therapist who helped design the survey. He digs in a little bit deeper into our findings and creates some understanding around our feelings and behaviours during this time. Anita Nair, research director here at The Coping Mechanism, begins by sharing our findings.
So it was really important at this time of big change, we're changing the way that we do society, to have a look at how people are experiencing that change, that rupture with normality. So we spoke to 600 people in London and in the Northwest through a survey, and they told us all about their experiences and how they're responding to those experiences, both through what we call resiliency, that kind of strengthening ourselves, and also through some sort of more psychological struggles they were going through. So that's those examples where actually we're finding it difficult ourselves and it's kind of psychologically damaging and damaging those around us. So we wanted to have a look at that holistically. And it was really important to see really how the changes are impacting how we ourselves are behaving, how are we responding? Are we growing? Are we getting stronger? Are we changing our behaviours? Are we adapting? Or are we struggling? And is that giving us kind of difficulty in managing? And also we were really interested in looking at the knock-on effect of how we're coping on other people. So some people experience change, times of transition, with the help of other people. So they rely on other people to help them to get through that change and almost resource themselves, learn from others. So we wanted to see if that was happening. Or if on the converse side, people who were struggling with the difficulty of the changes we're going through, if that was impacting relationships negatively, was that impacting the sort of scapegoating and blaming, for example, of minority communities. So we really wanted to see what was happening there to give us a good understanding of how communities are managing as well as people at this time of change. The groups who we spoke to were a mixture. So we spoke to what we call more privileged groups. So we spoke to those who are financially secure. Those were defined as people with 6 months of savings or more, as well as those who were financially insecure, those who were more likely to be unemployed and had no savings, no kind of fallback, because their experiences would be very different. We wanted to see how that resourced them in this change. And we also spoke to the different ethnic groups. So we spoke to the ethnic minority groups most affected by the pandemic, the South Asian, Black African and Black Caribbean groups who've seen high numbers of infections. And some studies have suggested this may be because of structural racism. We also want to look at the white majority group who have been less affected than those ethnic minorities to see how they're experiencing it and whether actually that relative privilege makes a difference as well in how we are developing resiliency, strengthening ourselves, or how we are actually struggling. And what kinds of struggles we might be dealing with. So that's what we looked at. And Micah, who is with us today, helped with the design of this survey. He will have some really interesting insights around why it was important to look at actually experience and some of the aspects of those experiences.
Thank you, Anita. Micah, could you expand on that and tell us a little bit more about why we looked at trauma in this study?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's a great question. I think it might be good to start with the fact, Anna referred to, there's been a lot of change for all of us, okay? And in times of change, the organism's response to change is often one of stress. right? So I think stress is maybe a flavor we've all been experiencing, since the pandemic began on some level or another, right? Whether it's with the, some of the maybe lower income groups that we've looked at, some of the more privileged groups we've looked at. But one thing that we did see was that there was substantial levels of stress. So if we define stress, and I think it's good to often start with definitions, like how are we defining this across the board, right? So if we look at stress, it's really our response to a stressor or an environmental condition or a change in our lives, right? So it's actually the proper response to change, right? When we experience stress, right? It shows that we're up against something that's difficult, okay? We can't live life without stress, right? Stress is actually necessary for us as organisms. Now, lots of stress isn't necessary, but a small amount is, right? It can even help motivate us, right? When we have a test or something and we get stressed, what do? We take the stress and we work towards change, right? We work towards studying for the test. That would just be one example. Now, when we use the word trauma, it's kind of an extension of that. We can look as trauma relates to stress, we could look at trauma through the lens of toxic stress. So maybe stress that starts to get on loop within inside of the physiological being, right? Within inside of our nervous system. Trauma comes, and one way I like to describe it is it's when safety has either been jeopardized or it's been removed. Okay, so if we look at that definition, it's pretty fitting for the time that we're in, because for many of us, the safety that was there before the pandemic hit is no longer there. People don't feel safe to maybe go outside of their homes. People don't feel safe around their financial situations. People may not feel safe around their careers or job trajectories, around maybe they're living now, they're stuck in houses with people that they actually don't feel safe with, where they were able to go to work every day, they were able to go to school every day, now they're not. So there's a lot of different types of circumstances that we're starting to find that may start to point towards trauma in this case, right? If we, again, are going on that definition of safety has been jeopardized or removed, right? It's very important that we name it in this, or frame it in this way, rather, because a lot of people think, oh, I don't have trauma. I wasn't shot, or I didn't go to the hospital, or nobody died, or, we think of these big extreme kind of cases of trauma, but there's a lot of subtle levels of trauma that can start showing up on an individual level and a community level. So I think that's really what some of the findings were very interesting that we found. So I don't know if you want to maybe go into that a little bit. Yeah, please.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Thank you for creating that definition. I'm just kind of aware of people that might be listening and feeling, I feel like I'm stressed, but I don't know if I'm traumatized. In terms of the emotional experience, how might somebody recognize in themselves that they are experiencing trauma?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So it starts to show up in ways in the body. So we know stress. Like let's again take stress. Stress will have a physiological response, right? We may start breathing more shallowly from the chest. We may notice sweaty palms or hands shaking or tightness in the jaw or tightness in the muscles, right? These would be some symptoms of stress. For most people, they're able to mitigate those, right? With help of community, with help of maybe spirituality or meditation practices or nature. There's so many different ways that we can kind of come down off the stress, where we fall asleep at night, right? We're able to let go of the stressors of the day, right? Or of the week or of the month, and come back to a level of homeostasis in the body, right? With trauma, it starts to look like we can't actually shake those symptoms off, right? So maybe we start noticing that we actually are starting to have insomnia. We're not able to put ourselves down each night, right? We are starting to notice that we're more in a state of hypervigilance or hyperarousal, right? Where we're maybe agitated, or we're getting snappy on people. That would be one end of the spectrum. Another end would be checking out, right? Levels of disassociation, levels of cloudiness, possibly even depression, sadness, gloomy outlooks on more pessimistic outlooks on the future. So these would be, it's when the symptoms start to become more sticky, if that makes sense. I don't know how else to describe it briefly, right? But it's like we're not able to shake off the symptoms as much as we might be able to in a normal kind of stressor situation, of which this is not, I want to point out.
Yeah, it's not a normal situation. And maybe if I can come in there as well and kind of show the breadth of responses. We asked people, like, what's the one emotion you felt most strongly since the beginning of this pandemic? And you can see right here that there's a really kind of broad set of responses that came there. So people are saying, as well as being worried, anxious and fearful, those were the ones who came through really strongly. We also have feelings like boredom, frustration, scared. So there are still some very strong emotions, but it's kind of a very broad range of emotions in response to the change that's happening. And kind of, I'll add to Micah's point as well. Sorts of comments we got were some of these experiences, which I might call trauma, and Micah, please chime in to say whether you would or not, were things like this comment. What's been a struggle for you? The person said, managing the boredom and the inability to go to places I previously took for granted. So that's that kind of the difficulty with the new pace of life. Somebody else wrote about the anxiety they get going to shops. So I'm struggling when you go to the shop and there's nothing on the shelf and everybody is rushing to buy food, and everything you buy is a struggle. So that just, and I think we can probably all relate to that kind of going to these shared spaces now can be quite anxiety inducing because there's, we don't know the rules anymore. So this kind of adjusting to the new normality in itself can be quite stressful.
I just wanted to quickly draw in on these experiences that both of you have raised. Now, these are all very intense experiences, but what about the long-term effects of these experiences? And I guess that relates to why it's important that we're looking at this in context of the pandemic. What are the potential long-term effects of these negative trauma experiences?
Well, I think if we go back to looking at the difference between stress and trauma, right? Stress, and again, this is really in layman's terms, but stress is something that we're ultimately able to integrate and to use like resiliency terms, maybe bounce back from or bounce forward from, we're able to integrate them in our lives. I think when we start looking at, and some of the things that we've been naming, right, some of these symptoms, we could look at trauma exposure responses. That would be a term that we use, right? So when we experience loss of safety, when we experience stress on a consistent level, it starts to turn toxic, right? It starts to turn toxic in the body, and it's going to start coming out in ways that are harmful for ourselves, our families, and the larger community. So I think these are the things that I'm interested in kind of tracking, is the length of how long do these symptoms continue for. Okay, that would be one thing to look at, right? So is it continuous that people are starting to notice that they are in this state of fear when they go to the store that doesn't actually start to become lessened in any way, right? So hypervigilance, helplessness, hopelessness would be a couple, fear, right? So is the fear front and center the majority of the time? I think so. It's really looking at the length of the symptoms and also the intensity of the symptoms that people are experiencing. So those are a few things for us to look at. And it's important for us to look at these things, even though it feels, it may feel heavy, right? Starting from this vantage point going right into stress and trauma. But if we look at the therapeutic continuum, which would be simply awareness of what is, acceptance of what is, from those two vantage points of awareness and acceptance, it's only then are we able to change. Right? We have to be aware of something, right? So I have to be aware that I'm hypervigilant. I have to be aware that I have fear, or that I have cynicism, or I'm minimizing, whatever the symptoms may be showing up. I have to accept that they're there, right? Just like we have to accept that the pandemic's there. Doesn't mean I have to like it, right? Keep in mind that's an important piece, right? There's lots of things in life we have to accept that we may not like, right? But from those two, the combination of that vantage point of acceptance and awareness, we're then able to be like, okay, how do I start to incorporate coping skills or techniques that can help me start to mitigate these symptoms and to heal my own self, right? So this is why we're starting with these pieces, so that we can start to look at different types of techniques and ways, whether it's communal, right, within our own larger communities, or whether it's within my own personal self-care practices. How do I start mitigating the effects of this, keeping in mind that there's no end in sight at this point, right? So it's like I feel for myself, specifically as a someone who works in the psychology field, it's an ethical imperative for me. And I could even argue it's the same way as a parent. It's an ethical imperative for my family to make sure that I'm trying and I'm doing everything I can to mitigate the effects of the stress and possible trauma of the pandemic.
Right. And just to jump in there as well with some of you've touched on something which I was quite heartened by in this survey, which is, you talked about the importance there of just accepting where we are and accepting we're in a time of uncertainty. And we could really see people doing that. That came across really, really strongly. So most people acknowledged that we were in it for the long term. Most people acknowledged that we were living in a time of uncertainty. Most people agreed that they're learning to take every day as it comes, which means they're adapting to uncertainty. So we did see some really kind of positive acknowledgement of where we are. And then I guess the question for people like us and community groups is to say, well, now that people are recognizing where we are, how do we support them to evolve in the new normal, which is so uncertain?
So Anna, you mentioned that there were some other interesting forms of resiliency. What could you expand a little bit more about what these other forms are?
Yeah, so we looked at different factors of resiliency, as well as seeing high levels of acceptance. We also saw that people were kind of reprioritizing their lives. So we had comments like, I've appreciated having the time out to reassess my life, to reassess my goals. People have appreciated not being so busy. And there were some behavioural changes as well. So this has been really positive. So people seeing sort of new possibilities for their lives, whether that's as simple as I'm just need to learn how to save money rather than spend it. Or on the other end, I'm appreciating family more. I appreciate family time. And we really are seeing that people are kind of leaning more into doing things differently. So spending time with my family, finding new ways to be with my family that doesn't involve going out and consumerism. So this is really, really interesting. We are adapting our behaviours according to the way our cloth is cut right now. And that's really positive. And there are some ethnic differences there as well. We see in the ethnic minority communities we've looked at, they tend to be more religious. So in the survey, we kind of had a high score for religiosity amongst those ethnic minority groups. It was a low score amongst the majority ethnic group. And within that, they're doing what we call spiritual resourcing. So they are, in those more religious groups, they tend to be leaning more into supporting the community and supporting the people around them to get through this. But we're also actually really interestingly seeing that spiritual resourcing, which is something that's very important in dealing with the trauma of a life change. We're seeing that spiritual resiliency even in the non-religious groups, in the form of reflection time. So people saying, I'm appreciating not being busy and having time to reflect. So we're seeing people almost taking a step back from life. Now the hullabaloo of our usual busy kind of British lifestyle has changed. They're now able to say, oh, now I've had this calm time, I can see things differently, and I'm appreciating not only what I can see differently, but also the fact that I have time to see things differently. And as psychologists, we see that reflection space as really important for people. It's a really strong resource, just having reflection space. So we're living in a time that's kind of forced us into that, and that's really positive.
Yeah, so maybe I can speak to that for just a moment. I hear what you're naming. There's this concept called post-traumatic growth. Okay, we hear this term post-traumatic stress a lot, right? It's essentially, that's that toxic stress, right? It's when a stressor comes to us and the stress becomes almost calcified in the nervous system and in the body. Okay, post-traumatic growth is an interesting concept because it shows that upwards of 70% of people who go through trauma, if they have the proper social support, maybe some of the factors that Anna just talked about, right? So maybe it's spiritual framework. Maybe there's a sense of realistic optimism, ability to face fear. All of these things start to point in the direction of post-traumatic growth, where not only do we become resilient, bounce back, but post-traumatic growth is we're actually bouncing forward. We're taking what the seemingly very difficult experience, whether it's stress or it's difficult trauma, and we're using it as a catalyst to do what? To make meaning in our lives, right? So some of the things I think that you're speaking to, and I found fascinating, is that making meaning is one of the most essential pieces from a therapeutic point of view for us to heal from stress and trauma. Right? There's almost like a split in two different ways we could go when we experience that. One is, who's responsible? Who do I point the finger at? Blaming, shaming, scapegoating, right? And we saw some of this in the finding, right? That's one direction to go in. And I want to just clarify that this doesn't mean it's not important for us to look for responsibility, hold governments responsible, individuals responsible, communities responsible. That's not what I'm saying. It is important, but we can fall down that rabbit hole of blame and shame, right? The other direction we can go in is what? What does this mean to me over the larger arc of my life? How do I begin to integrate this? How do I reframe? And we use that a lot in psychology, right? When someone goes to see a therapist or psychologist, they may be looking at it through a particular lens, right? They have the lens that they're staring at this one thing in. And a psychologist or therapist may be like, well, try this lens and look at it from this angle. And it's like, oh, I never thought of looking at it from that way. Well, people can do that on their own. Right. And this is the beauty of this. So when people go into meaning making, like we're starting to see, I have more time with my family. Right. I have more time for reflection. Right. So we saw reports that gratitude was like up more than it had been before. That's interesting. Right. We're all under stress. A lot of us are traumatized. We're in a very difficult situation, and gratitude's going up. That's interesting. So that really points us, for me, that's very hopeful, right? Because we're starting to already see that people are making meaning on their own.
Yeah.
Which is really a very, very good sign, right? And I think the question for us is like, how do we begin to how do we promote that more and more? I think from within. I think that's what I'm really interested in.
Yeah, likewise. I think that in terms of community groups who are watching these podcasts and wondering what they can do, we're really trying to gear the future podcast towards that. So we're really looking at, like, how can we work with what people are already doing in terms of resiliency.
Actually, Micah, something I did want to ask you a little bit more about is when you talk about the post-traumatic growth, I've come across the concept of anti-fragility. Could you discuss a little bit more about how post-traumatic growth helps develop us as individuals? Like, what kind of developments we might see through that those sorts of perspectives through traumatic experiences?
Yeah. I love that. I love that you brought up anti-fragility. We can, they're very related, right? So again, we think of resiliency as bouncing back, and I think post-traumatic growth and anti-fragility point to bouncing forward, right? So, there's the idea of, let's say if there's a tree that's in a grove of trees, right? It'll grow and it'll be healthy, but there's this argument that that tree that's actually by itself in the field, that has to weather the storm, right? That has to be open to the elements. That helps it become more rooted, more grounded, right? So there's an alchemy in that, right? The seemingly difficult situation that the tree may be in actually helps it become stronger, more whole and healthy. So in a similar way, there's this alchemy that can happen, and it can happen on its own, but it can happen more in depth when there are these other resiliency factors, right? Like we named, right? So community, spiritual resourcing, even things like physical fitness, right? All of these things start to help create this kind of soup in a way, right? It's this recipe for resiliency. So the post-traumatic growth is very, very important. And it'll be continuously important for us to look at, because we want to see, is the community able to thrive and come back better? That's right. Come back more whole, more skillful, more understanding, more compassionate, right? Being able to lean into gratitude more as a practice, not just because things are difficult and I'm at home and I'm with my kids more, but even when I go back to work, am I able to hold on to that gratitude? This is what we want to start really trying to not only look for, but promote within our communities. And I think hopefully that'll be one of the end results of all of these podcasts, is that it gives people these more specific tools in various sectors, right? Not only psychology, right? But just community support, whatever it may be, that we're bouncing forward, not just back.
Why is it important that as individuals, we are reflective on our experiences and behaviors through trauma in terms of the way that then affects our community?
Yeah, I mean, they're directly related, right? So if we look at the individual, when the individual does their own work and they find meaning, in my experience, that spreads to, like, we can think of it as rings, right? So there's the center, and then there's the next ring. Well, for me, the next ring is my immediate family who I live with. So when I'm in a state of healing, that's going to directly affect my family who I live with, right? If I'm in a state of trauma exposure response, right, like checking out or becoming agitated, that in turn is also going to directly affect my family, right, who I live with. If we take that ring and keep widening it, right, we can start to see that there's a systemic, it can start to branch out into what's the next level? Maybe it's my job, right? Maybe it's my religious community. Maybe it's my sports team that I play with, right? So there's all these larger levels of community. So it may sound cliche, but the inner work starts with us, right? And there's a direct correlation with our own inner work, our own reflection, our own ability to lean into gratitude, to lean into resilience factors that's going to spill out. Just like if we don't do it, you think about it, when we're in a state of agitation or anger or difficulty, who are the people who are directly affected usually in the worst ways? They're the people closest to us. They're the people we love the most.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that really resonates with me, because as an artist, I feel very strongly about the importance of individuals seeing the part that they play in the community, and how by just working on themselves and bettering themselves, they're actually impacting those around them. So I couldn't agree more. Anita, did you have any perspectives or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think just to kind of add to that, I think it's really interesting to think about the impact of how we're managing ourselves on the people around us. And there's also a furthering, isn't there, which is the communities around us, and communities who are outsiders as well. So when we're agitated as well, it can be just as easy to send that agitation in the direction of people who we don't really see as people, sort of people who can carry our blame. And that's really interesting. We'll get into that in future podcasts as well, how actually where we're not coping very well, how that looks like it may impact relationships between communities, as well as within our families and within our own communities. And how the opposite is happening too. So how we're also seeing people building community through this. It's really important.
So Anita, we've looked at trauma, resilience and meaning making in this podcast, which is set the foundation for the following podcast. What can we expect to see in the following podcast?
So yes, we'll be looking at a few of the findings in more detail, and how community groups can really embrace those to support people through this time, to help us to do that post-traumatic growth, to grow as individuals and as communities. Examples are, we'll be looking a bit more at the role of gratitude, which is something we've seen a lot of, and that's really positive, people really appreciating things about their lives. We'll also be looking on the kind of converse side at things like blaming and scapegoating, which we've also seen a lot of, which is where people are struggling to deal with the kind of difficult emotions. We'll be leaning into that a bit. And we'll be looking also at sort of community relations. So we've seen differences in how ethnic minorities and the ethnic majority are responding. So we'll have a look at what we've called the COVID conflict, which is this kind of, on one side, people are wanting to act more as a unit with their communities, they're wanting more togetherness. On the other side, we're seeing kind of slightly more racial divisions coming up. So we'll lean into that a little bit as well. So those are some examples. There are going to be 7 podcasts in total, and they'll just look at some of those specific areas of our findings and how we're coping and what that means. Importantly, we'll be looking more at what does this mean for community groups? What does this mean for the sorts of support we need to offer? What do we need to lean into?
Okay, thank you, Anita. Thank you to you both for your really insightful contributions.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Something that really stood out to me in this podcast is Micah explaining the importance of the relationship between positive self-development and the betterment of the wider community. This topic really sits at a foundation level, not only in understanding what's going on, but why it's important that we look at coping through the pandemic. It's also important to gain a sound understanding of what's happening psychologically to better be able to support people in our communities. If you have any thoughts or questions, please do leave them in the comment section. Thank you for joining us at the Coping Mechanism in this discussion, and we look forward to welcoming you